Kelveth stood at the edge of the landing platform and watched the human transport ship descend through the clouds. The vessel was small and ugly compared to Valorian warships. It had sharp angles where there should have been curves, and its hull was covered in scorch marks from countless battles. Kelveth did not think much of it. He had been a soldier in the Valorian Empire for nearly 200 years. In that time, he had fought alongside many different species from across the galaxy. Some were brave, some were clever, some were strong, but none of them had ever impressed him the way his own people did. The Valorians were the finest warriors in the known universe. Everyone said so. Kelveth believed it with all his heart. These humans were different. They were new to the galaxy. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 60 years ago. That was nothing. A blink of an eye in the long history of spacefaring civilizations. Kelveth had fought in wars that lasted longer than the entire human space program. The transport ship landed with a loud hiss of steam and pressure. The loading ramp dropped down, and the first humans walked out into the pale light of the staging world. Kelveth studied them carefully. They were small, much smaller than Valorians. The tallest human barely reached Kelveth's chest. Their skin was soft and pink, without scales or armor of any kind. Their eyes were round and wet, like the eyes of prey animals. Their bodies looked fragile, like they might break if you squeezed them too hard. Kelveth felt disappointment settle into his stomach. These were the soldiers he would be fighting alongside? These soft little creatures? The Galactic Council must have been desperate to approve this joint operation. A human male walked toward him. He was average height for his species, with brown skin and dark hair cut very short. He wore a simple military uniform with a captain's insignia on the shoulder. There was a small smile on his face, as if he was happy to be here, as if he was looking forward to the war. The human stopped in front of Kelveth and extended his hand. This was a human greeting, Kelveth knew. A strange custom where they grabbed each other's hands and moved them up and down. He had studied human culture before this mission. He wanted to understand his new allies, even if he did not expect much from them. Kelveth reached down and took the human's hand. It was warm and soft, just as he expected. "Captain Danny Ortega," the human said. "3rd Battalion, Earth Expeditionary Force. You must be Commander Kelveth. I've heard a lot about you." Kelveth nodded slowly. "I have heard nothing about you." He did not mean it as an insult. It was simply the truth. But the human laughed anyway, as if Kelveth had made a joke. "Fair enough," Danny said. "We're pretty new to all this. But don't worry. We learn fast." Another human stepped forward. This one was female, with short red hair and pale skin covered in small brown spots. There was a long scar running down her left forearm, thick and ragged, like something had tried to tear her arm off. She did not smile like Danny did. Her eyes were sharp and cold, studying Kelveth the same way he was studying her. "Lieutenant Katie Vance," she said. Her voice was flat and calm. "I'm the captain's second in command." Kelveth looked at the scar on her arm. "You have been wounded before." "Many times," Katie said. She did not seem bothered by his observation. "We all have." More humans were coming down the ramp now. Kelveth counted about 300 of them. They carried their equipment on their backs and their weapons in their hands. Some of them were talking and laughing with each other. Others were quiet and serious. A few of them looked up at Kelveth with curiosity in their eyes, but none of them seemed afraid of him. That was strange. Most species were afraid of Valorians when they first met them. Kelveth was over 2 meters tall, with thick gray scales covering his body and claws on his hands and feet. His eyes were yellow and had vertical pupils like a snake. He looked dangerous because he was dangerous. Most creatures understood this instinctively. The humans did not seem to care. Danny followed. Calveth gazed to the soldiers unloading from the ship. "Good people," he said. "Every single one of them volunteered for this mission. They know what we're up against. They know the odds. They came anyway." Calveth made a low rumbling sound in his throat. It was the Valorian equivalent of a skeptical grunt. "The Dracthyr are not like any enemy you have faced before. They are born for war. They feel no pain. They feel no fear. They will not stop until they are dead, and there are millions of them on Nexus 7. "I know," Danny said. His smile faded a little, but his eyes stayed calm. "We've studied the reports. We know what they can do." "Reports are not the same as experience," Calveth said. "You have never fought the Dracthyr. You do not know what it is like to watch them come at you in waves that never end. You do not know what it is like to kill 100 of them and see 1,000 more take their place." Danny nodded slowly. "You're right. We don't know. Not yet." He looked up at Calveth, and there was something in his eyes that the Valorian could not identify. Something hard and quiet and patient. "But we'll learn. Like I said, we learn fast." Calveth did not know what to say to that. He had met many soldiers in his long life who talked big before their first real battle. Most of them died quickly. The ones who survived usually lost that confidence and became careful and humble. He wondered which kind of soldier Danny Ortega would turn out to be. The briefing came 2 hours later. Calveth stood at the front of the room and explained the mission to the combined human and Valorian forces. They would be dropping onto Nexus 7, a planet that the Dracthyr had conquered and turned into one of their hive worlds. Their objective was to destroy the primary hive and kill the queen inside. If they succeeded, the Dracthyr forces on the planet would fall into chaos. If they failed, they would all die. The Valorian soldiers listened in grim silence. They understood the danger. They had fought the Dracthyr before and knew how terrible they were. The humans listened too. But Calveth noticed that many of them were still smiling, still joking with each other in whispered voices, still acting like this was some kind of adventure instead of a suicide mission. He did not understand them. He did not understand them at all, but in the days to come, Calveth would learn. He would learn that these small, soft, fragile creatures were nothing like what they appeared to be. He would learn that the smile on Danny Ortega's face was not the smile of ignorance. It was the smile of something far more dangerous. He just did not know it yet. The drop onto Nexus 7 was worse than Calveth expected. The Dracthyr anti-air defenses were stronger than intelligence had reported. Much stronger. As the landing craft fell through the atmosphere, Calveth watched through the small window as 3 Valorian ships exploded in bright orange fireballs. Then 4, then 5. The soldiers around him were silent. Some of them were praying to the old gods. Others were just staring at nothing, their faces blank with fear. Calveth understood. He had felt this way before his first battle 200 years ago. The waiting was always the worst part. A human dropship passed in front of their window. Calveth saw the Earth flag painted on its side, a circle of stars on a blue background. Then a beam of green light cut through the sky and hit the ship directly in the middle. The vessel broke apart like a toy, spinning and burning as it fell toward the planet below. Calveth closed his eyes. At least 300 humans had been on that ship. Now they were all dead. The war had not even started yet, and already the humans had lost a quarter of their forces. This was going to be a disaster. He was sure of it. The landing craft hit the ground hard. Calveth and his soldiers poured out into the gray light of Nexus 7. The air smelled like acid and rot. The ground was soft and wet, covered in some kind of organic material that the Dracthyr used to reshape planets to their liking. In the distance, Calveth could see the massive shape of the primary hive rising up like a mountain of black flesh. They had landed in a marsh, about 10 kilometers from their objective. It was not a good position. The ground was unstable, and there was very little cover. If the Dracthyr attacked now, they would be completely exposed. Calveth started organizing his soldiers into defensive formations. He tried to contact the human commanders on the radio, but there was too much interference. The Dracthyr were jamming their communications. They were alone. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Calveth was starting to think they might have time to dig in before the first attack when he heard something strange. Voices. Human voices. Coming from the direction of the crashed dropship. He turned and saw a group of figures emerging from the marsh. They were covered in mud and blood and burn marks. Their uniforms were torn and melted. Some of them were limping. Some of them were being carried by others. But they were alive. They were moving. They were coming to join the fight. At the front of the group was a large human male with a shaved head and a thick beard. He was carrying 2 wounded soldiers on his back, one over each shoulder. His face was red and sweating, and the skin on his arms was covered in terrible burns where his uniform had melted into his flesh. But he was still walking, still moving forward, still refusing to stop. The human reached the Valorian line and carefully set the wounded soldiers down on the ground. Then he stood up straight, looked at Calveth, and saluted. "Sergeant Pete Ramos, reporting for duty," he said. His voice was rough with pain, but steady. "Sorry we're late. Had some trouble with the landing." Calveth stared at him. The burns on his arms were serious. 3rd degree at least. The human should have been screaming in agony. He should have been begging for medical attention. Instead, he was standing at attention, ready to fight. "You need medical care," Calveth said. Pete shrugged. "Later. Where do you need me?" Before Calveth could answer, the Dracthyr attacked. They came from everywhere at once. From the marsh. From the sky. From holes in the ground that Calveth had not even noticed. Thousands of them, their black bodies gleaming with slime, their mouths full of razor-sharp teeth. They made no sound except for the clicking of their claws and the wet slapping of their feet on the organic ground. Calveth raised his plasma rifle and began firing. Each shot burned a hole through a Dracthyr body. But for every one he killed, 3 more took its place. This was how they always fought. This was why they were so terrifying. They had no fear of death. They just kept coming. The Valorian soldiers fought with discipline and precision. They held their lines. They covered each other. They did everything right. But Calveth could see that it was not going to be enough. There were too many Dracthyr. The line was going to break. Then he saw the humans. They did not fight like Valorians. They did not fight like any species Calveth had ever seen. A young human male with brown hair ran screaming into a group of Dracthyr. He was firing his weapon with one hand and swinging a combat knife with the other. His face was twisted with rage, and he was yelling words that Calveth did not understand. Words that sounded like curses. The Dracthyr tried to surround him, but he moved too fast, too wild, too unpredictable. He killed 5 of them before they could touch him. A human female with short black hair had abandoned her rifle entirely. She had 2 knives now, one in each hand, and she was dancing through the enemy like water through rocks. Her movements were beautiful and terrible. Every strike was a kill. Every dodge was perfect. She was covered in Dracthyr blood, and she was smiling. Captain Danny Ortega was at the center of the fighting. A Dracthyr Alpha, 3 times his size, had knocked his weapon away and pinned him to the ground. Its massive jaws were opening, ready to bite his head off. Calveth tried to aim his rifle, but there were too many bodies in the way. He could not get a clear shot. Then Danny laughed. He actually laughed, with a monster's teeth inches from his face. He reached down to his belt, pulled out a small round object, and pressed it against the Dracthyr's skull. A grenade. The explosion was bright and loud. Kelveth saw Danny's body thrown backward by the blast. He saw the Dracthyr Alpha's head disappear in a cloud of green and red. He was sure the human captain was dead, but when the smoke cleared, Danny was sitting up. His left hand was a bloody mess, missing at least 3 fingers. His face was covered in burns. But he was alive, and he was laughing. "Someone get me another gun," he said. "I'm not done yet." Kelveth stood frozen in the middle of the battle. All around him, humans were fighting with the same wild abandon. They were charging into certain death with smiles on their faces. They were taking wounds that should have killed them and refusing to fall. They were treating this desperate last stand like it was some kind of game. For the first time in 200 years, Kelveth felt something he did not recognize. A cold feeling in his chest, a tightness in his throat, a trembling in his hands that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. It took him a moment to understand what it was. Fear, not fear of the Dracthyr. He had faced them many times and survived. No, this was different. This was fear of the creatures fighting beside him. These small, soft, fragile beings who refused to die, who refused to give up, who laughed in the face of certain death. What kind of monsters had the universe created? And what would happen when the galaxy finally understood what humans really were? The battle for Nexus 7 did not end after the first day, or the second, or the third. It went on, day after day, night after night, until Kelveth lost track of how long they had been fighting. The joint battalion had been forced to retreat from the marsh. They lost too many soldiers in that first engagement, and the Dracthyr reinforcements never stopped coming. Kelveth made the decision to pull back to an abandoned mining outpost about 5 kilometers from the primary hive. It was not a good position, but it was better than dying in the open. The outpost was old and damaged. The walls were made of thick metal, but there were holes and cracks everywhere. The power systems barely worked. There was no clean water and very little food. But it was something. It was shelter. It was a place where they could rest and regroup before the next attack. Except the attacks never stopped. The Dracthyr surrounded them on the third day. Tens of thousands of them, forming a living wall around the outpost. They did not attack all at once. That was not their way. Instead, they sent waves of warriors at random intervals, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at night, sometimes in the middle of a meal or a rest period. They wanted to wear the defenders down. They wanted to break their spirit before they broke their bodies. It was a good strategy. Kelveth had seen it work before on other worlds, against other species. Eventually, the constant pressure became too much. Soldiers stopped sleeping. They stopped eating. They started making mistakes. And when the final assault came, they were too tired and too broken to fight back. Kelveth expected the humans to break first. They were new to this kind of war. They had never experienced the grinding horror of a Dracthyr siege. Their bodies were weaker than Valorians, and their minds should have been weaker too. He was wrong. On the 10th day, the food ran out. The supply ships could not get through the Dracthyr blockade, and the emergency rations were gone. Kelveth called a meeting of the surviving officers to discuss the situation. He expected panic. He expected arguments. He expected someone to suggest surrender. Instead, Danny Ortega stood up and smiled. "We've got plenty of food," he said. "We just need to go get it." That night, Danny led a small team of humans out into the Dracthyr lines. They moved in the darkness, silent and deadly, and attacked a Dracthyr supply nest about 2 kilometers from the outpost. They killed the guards, destroyed the eggs, and brought back enough organic material to feed the entire battalion for a week. Kelveth did not understand. The Dracthyr food was disgusting. It was meant for their larvae, not for humanoid consumption. But the humans ate it without complaint. They cooked it over small fires, added some kind of powder from their medical kits to make it safe, and shared it equally with the Valorian soldiers. "It's not so bad," Katie Vance said when she saw Calveth staring at his portion. "We've eaten worse. You should try the military rations from basic training. Those will kill you faster than any Dracther." The humans laughed at her joke. Calveth did not understand what was funny. On the 20th day, the ammunition started to run low. The plasma cells for the Valorian rifles were almost gone, and the human projectile weapons were down to their last few magazines. Without ammunition, they would be defenseless. Sergeant Pete Ramos gathered a team of human engineers and disappeared into the lower levels of the outpost. They were gone for 2 days. When they came back, they were carrying weapons made from mining equipment and scrap metal. "They're not pretty," Pete said, holding up something that looked like a cross between a drill and a shotgun. "But they work, and we can make more." The humans taught the Valorians how to use the improvised weapons. They were loud and clumsy and dangerous to the user, but they killed Dracther just as well as plasma rifles. Maybe even better. On the 28th day, a human soldier named Nick Delgado lost his leg in an ambush. The Dracther caught him outside the walls during a patrol and nearly tore him apart before his squad could rescue him. The battalion's medic, a young woman named Rosa Medina, managed to stop the bleeding and save his life. But everyone knew he would never fight again. 3 days later, Nick was back on the defensive line. His right leg was gone below the knee, replaced by a crude metal prosthetic that the engineers had welded together from spare parts. He could barely walk. Every step must have been agony. But he was there, holding a weapon, ready to fight. Calveth approached him during a quiet moment. "Why are you here?" he asked. "You have done enough. No one would blame you for resting." Nick looked at him with tired eyes. "My friends are fighting. How can I rest when they're dying?" Calveth had no answer. On the 35th day, Lieutenant Vance organized a night raid on one of the Dracther command nests. It was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by thousands of warriors. The chances of success were almost zero. The chances of survival were even lower. 20 humans volunteered. They knew they were probably going to die. They went anyway. 16 of them came back. They had destroyed the command nest, killed 3 Dracther generals, and thrown the entire eastern flank of the enemy army into chaos. The 4 who did not return had stayed behind to cover the retreat. They had fought to the last breath, giving their lives so their friends could escape. The humans held a small ceremony for the fallen that night. They did not cry. They did not wail or tear their clothes or curse the gods. They simply stood together in silence, heads bowed, and remembered. Then Danny Ortega raised a cup of water and spoke. "To the fallen," he said, "they died so we could live. We will not waste their gift." The other humans raised their cups and drank. Then they went back to their posts, back to their weapons, back to the endless war. Calveth watched them go, and the cold feeling in his chest grew stronger. He had fought alongside many species over his long life. He had seen courage and cowardice, strength and weakness, hope and despair. But he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen a people who simply refused to give up, no matter how bad things got, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. That night, Calveth approached Danny Ortega in the command center. The human captain was studying maps and reports, his ruined hand wrapped in dirty bandages, dark circles under his eyes. "How do you do it?" Calveth asked. "How do your people maintain their spirit when everything is lost?" Danny looked up at him and smiled that same easy smile from the first day. "Nothing is lost until we're all dead," he said. "And even then, we'll find a way to spit in death's eye one more time." Calveth did not understand, but he was beginning to. He was beginning to understand why the universe should be afraid of humanity. On the 42nd day of the siege, Calveth knew they were going to die. He stood on the walls of the outpost and looked out at the army that had gathered against them. The Dracthyr had been massing their forces for days, pulling warriors from every corner of the planet. Now they were ready. Now they had come for the final kill. There were so many of them. The ground was black with their bodies, stretching from the base of the walls all the way to the horizon. The sky was dark with their flying swarms, millions of winged creatures blocking out the pale sun. The air was filled with the clicking and chittering of their communication, a sound like a billion insects all speaking at once. Calveth had seen many terrible things in his life, but this was the worst. This was the end of everything. He looked at his Valorian soldiers. They were standing at their posts, weapons in hand, but he could see the despair in their eyes. Some of them were crying. Others were praying, their lips moving in silent words to gods who had never answered. A few had simply sat down on the ground, staring at nothing, already dead inside even though their bodies still breathed. Calveth understood. There was no shame in fear. There was no dishonor in accepting death when it was certain. The Dracthyr would overwhelm them in minutes. They would be torn apart and consumed. Their bodies used to feed the hive, their bones scattered across the organic ground. Nothing would remain. No one would remember. This was how it ended. Then he heard the singing. It started soft, almost too quiet to hear over the clicking of the Dracthyr. A single human voice, somewhere behind him, rising up into the gray sky. The words were in a language Calveth did not understand, but the melody was strong and proud and defiant. He turned and saw a human woman standing on the highest point of the outpost. She was holding a metal pole with a piece of cloth attached to it. A flag, the human flag, the one with the stars and stripes. It was torn and dirty and stained with blood, but it was still there. Still waving in the wind. The woman's name was Megan Torres. She was a sergeant, one of the few surviving members of the original landing force. She had been wounded 3 times during the siege and had refused evacuation each time. Now she was standing alone on the highest point in the outpost, planting her flag where everyone could see it, and she was singing. Other voices joined her. One by one, the human soldiers stopped what they were doing and started to sing. The words spread through the battalion like fire, jumping from person to person, until every human in the outpost was singing the same song. Calveth did not know what the words meant, but he understood the meaning. This was not a song of despair. This was not a funeral hymn. This was a battle cry, a declaration of defiance, a promise that they would not go quietly into the darkness. The Valorian soldiers stared at the humans with confusion and wonder. How could they sing at a time like this? How could they stand tall when death was certain? What was wrong with them? Danny Ortega walked along the defensive line, stopping to speak with each soldier, human and Valorian alike. He was smiling. Of course he was smiling. He was always smiling. His ruined hand was wrapped in fresh bandages, and there was a new weapon at his hip. One of the improvised guns that the engineers had built. He stopped in front of Calveth and looked up at him. Beautiful day for a last stand, don't you think? Danny said. Calveth stared at him. We are going to die. Probably, Danny agreed. But not without a fight. And not without making them remember us. Remember us? Calveth shook his head. There will be no one left to remember. Danny's smile faded a little, but his eyes stayed bright. You're wrong about that. Someone always survives. Someone always tells the story. And when they tell this story, they'll say that we stood our ground. They'll say that we looked death in the face, and we didn't blink. He reached up and put his good hand on Calveth's arm. That's what matters. Not whether we live or die. What matters is how we face the end. Calveth wanted to argue. He wanted to say that this was foolish, that there was no glory in dying for nothing, that a smart soldier knew when to retreat, But the words would not come, because deep down, he knew that Danny was right. "Are you afraid?" Calveth asked. Danny laughed, terrified. "I've been afraid since the moment we landed on this rock. But fear doesn't mean you stop fighting. Fear just means you're paying attention." He looked out at the massive Dracthyr army, and his smile came back, sharper and harder than before. "You know what the difference is between us and everyone else in this galaxy?" Calveth shook his head. "Everyone else asks if they can win," Danny said. "We just ask how many of them we can take with us." The Dracthyr attacked. They came in a wave that seemed to have no end. The ground shook with their footsteps. The air screamed with their flying swarms. The walls of the outpost trembled as millions of bodies slammed against them, clawing and biting and tearing. Calveth raised his weapon and fired into the endless mass of enemies. He killed one. He killed 10. He killed 100. It made no difference. More came to take their place. Always more dot around him. Humans and Valorians fought side by side. They screamed and cursed and bled. They died in terrible ways, torn apart by claws and teeth and acid. But they did not run. They did not surrender. They stood their ground and fought. Sergeant Torres fell first, pulled from her perch by a swarm of flying Dracthyr. She was still holding her flag when she died. Private Ben Garza lasted longer, fighting with a fury that seemed almost inhuman, killing Dracthyr with his bare hands when his weapons were torn away. He fell with his fingers around an enemy's throat. Katie Vance was everywhere at once, leading counterattacks, plugging holes in the line, carrying wounded soldiers to safety. She moved like a ghost, appearing wherever she was needed most, her knives flashing in the gray light. Danny Ortega stood at the center of it all. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His improvised gun had jammed, so he had thrown it at a Dracthyr's head and pulled out a combat knife instead. He was laughing. Of course he was laughing. Calveth watched him cut down enemy after enemy, and he felt something change inside himself. The cold fear in his chest was still there. But now there was something else too. Something hot and bright and fierce. He did not have a name for it. But the humans did. They called it courage. And for the first time in 200 years, Calveth understood what that word really meant. The relief fleet arrived on the 43rd day. Calveth was barely conscious when the first orbital strikes began. He was lying on his back in the mud, surrounded by dead Dracthyr, his body broken in more places than he could count. The sky above him was filled with fire. The Dracthyr were screaming, a high-pitched sound he had never heard them make before. They were afraid. For the first time in the entire siege, the Dracthyr were afraid. The bombardment lasted for hours. Calveth drifted in and out of consciousness, watching the fire fall from the sky like rain. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost painful. No clicking, no chittering, no sounds of battle. Just the wind blowing across the ruined landscape. A face appeared above him. Human, female, short black hair and dark eyes filled with concern. "Commander Calveth? Can you hear me? Stay with me. Help is coming." It was Katie Vance. She was covered in blood and dirt, and there was a fresh wound on her face that would probably leave a scar. But she was alive. She was still fighting. Of course she was. The medics came and took Calveth to a transport ship. He was too weak to walk, too weak to speak, too weak to do anything but lie on the stretcher and stare at the ceiling. But his mind was still working. His mind was still trying to understand. They had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything that should have been possible, they had survived. Calveth spent 3 weeks in a medical facility, recovering from his wounds. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. His body had taken damage that would have killed most Valorians. But he had survived. Just like the humans, When he was strong enough to walk, he went to find the other survivors. There were fewer than 200 of them. Out of more than 1,000 soldiers who had landed on Nexus 7, only 200 remained. The Dracther had killed everyone else. Kelveth had expected the survivors to be broken, traumatized, destroyed by what they had experienced. He was wrong. The humans were already planning their next mission. They were studying maps, analyzing data, preparing for the next battle. Some of them were wounded even worse than Kelveth. Nick Delgado was there, his metal leg replaced by a proper prosthetic now, walking with only a slight limp. Rosa Medina was there, her arm in a sling, helping treat the soldiers who were still recovering. And Danny Ortega was there. Calva found him in the command center, talking with officers from the relief fleet. He looked different than before. Older, somehow. There were new lines on his face and new gray hairs in his temples. His ruined hand had been replaced with a mechanical prosthetic, silver fingers that moved with perfect precision. But his eyes were the same, calm, patient. Ready. Danny saw Kelveth and smiled. That same easy smile from the first day. "Commander," he said, "good to see you on your feet. How are you feeling?" Kelveth did not know how to answer. How was he feeling? He was feeling too many things. Relief that they had survived. Grief for the soldiers they had lost. Confusion about everything he had witnessed. And fear. Still fear. The cold feeling in his chest that had started on the first day and never really gone away. "I do not understand," Kelveth said finally. "How are you not broken? How are any of you not broken?" Danny's smile faded, and something more serious took its place. He walked over to Kelveth and put his good hand on the Valorian's shoulder. "We are broken," he said quietly. "Every single one of us. We carry wounds that will never heal. We see the faces of our dead friends every time we close our eyes. We wake up screaming from nightmares that feel more real than reality." He paused and took a deep breath. "But being broken doesn't mean you stop fighting. It just means you have to fight harder." Kelveth thought about this for a long time. In the years that followed, Kelveth rose through the ranks of the Galactic Alliance military. He became one of the most respected Valorian commanders in history, winning battles that others thought impossible, leading soldiers of a dozen species to victory against the most dangerous enemies in the known universe. And wherever he went, he requested human soldiers in his battalion. The other Valorians thought he was crazy. Humans were still seen as young and inexperienced, useful in small numbers, but not worth building an entire strategy around. But Kelveth knew better. He had fought beside humans. He had seen what they could do. He had learned to be afraid of them. Not afraid in the way you fear an enemy. Afraid in the way you fear a storm. Afraid in the way you fear a force of nature. Humans were not just soldiers. They were something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never seen before. They had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them every single day. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters. They had clawed their way up from nothing, fighting every step of the way, refusing to die no matter how hard the universe tried to destroy them. And now they were in space. Now they were spreading across the stars. Now they were fighting alongside species who had been in the galaxy for thousands of years. And they were showing everyone what true determination looked like. When younger, Valorian soldiers asked Kelveth what it was like to fight beside humans. He always told them the same thing. "It is terrifying," he would say. And I mean that is the highest possible compliment. Sometimes they would laugh, thinking he was joking. He never laughed with them. He was not joking, because Kelveth had learned something on Nexus 7. Something that changed him forever. Something that he would carry with him until the day he died. He had learned that true fear was not facing an enemy that could kill you. Every soldier faced that. Every warrior understood that danger. True fear was standing beside an ally that simply refused to die. True fear was watching a human smile in the face of certain death and ask how many enemies they could take with them. True fear was realizing that the small, soft, fragile creatures from a distant blue planet were not weak at all. They were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and they were only getting started. Kelveth had felt many emotions in his long life, but fighting next to humans, he felt fear in a way he never had before, and he was grateful for it, because that fear had taught him what it truly meant to be alive.